coming, scientists. They're coming! They're coming!
Good evening. Last night on BBC Two, Threads, a drama based on the latest available research, showed what could happen in the city of Sheffield after a large-scale nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. Tonight we examine the evidence for the theory of a prolonged nuclear winter that many scientists now believe would be triggered off by a major nuclear exchange. On the 8th day explores the current state of research in this field, and already governments are taking the findings very seriously because of the implications a nuclear winter would have for current strategy and, as seen in Threads, for civil defense. These are some of the issues that I'll be raising later in a Newsnight special debate with politicians and experts from both sides of the Atlantic. But first, the full story of how scientists in both the Soviet Union and the West started to realize that, far more than anyone suspected before, a nuclear exchange would fundamentally alter the world as we know it, and that the fallout would not just be of the radioactive kind.
On November the 1st, 1983, Moscow and Washington were linked by satellite and television for a most unusual scientific conference.
Я бы хотел предоставить слово Юрию Антоновичу Израилю. Пожалуйста. Благодарю вас.
Leading scientists from East and West had gathered to discuss the consequences to our planet of a nuclear war, using simultaneous translation.
Circumstances of an increasing arms race has already led to the appearance of a number of global ecological problems. It is quite clear that in the event of a nuclear war, the effects on the biosphere will be magnified many times.
The conference was called by independent American scientists, including Carl Sagan, the astronomer, on the left, and Paul Ehrlich, biologist. Their purpose was to discuss new work by atmospheric scientists, which predicts that the climate of the Earth could change dramatically after a nuclear war, with weeks or months of darkness and intense cold.
It was no surprise to my colleagues in the Soviet Union, namely that a very large group of prominent biologists in the United States presented with the scenarios that Dr. Sagan just described, could come to a unanimous conclusion on the consequences for biological systems.
The drop in temperature being discussed would be great enough to cause the extinction of thousands of species and to destroy food crops over much of the planet. Results that cast doubt on the credibility of current nuclear strategy.
In a so-called limited nuclear war. This again stresses that in a nuclear war there can be no victor and no vanquished. In the final analysis, all sides suffer fatally, and Professor Sagan has already spoken of this at the beginning of the conference. Thus we are raising the very question of life on Earth.
The nuclear age began when the first atom bomb was exploded in 1945 in New Mexico. Scientists then knew little about the effects of a nuclear explosion. But now it's thought that this test may have caused hundreds of deaths from leukemia. Only 3 weeks later, the first atom bomb was used in warfare. Hiroshima had been spared conventional bombing so that the effects of this grim experiment could be documented with precision. Time stood still at 12 minutes past 8 on August the 6th. 6 months later, a Hollywood film crew was conscripted to record the devastation. What the film cannot show is that more than a third of the energy of the bomb was released as heat. In 1980, witnesses of the attack gave evidence to a Senate committee in Washington.
That morning I heard the airplane, and I looked up and I saw something drop from the plane. And just then I felt a strong wind and strong light, and I was knocked down. Suddenly, I was sort of in a big fire, red, grey, dark. I could not see anything. Then, I cannot say how long it took, and I could see around. Surrounding me was like a different world, completely changed, sort of a hell. The people were not like people, more like monsters. I'd never seen such a horrible-looking people.
I was thrown across the schoolyard. The air was so hot I thought I would die. And the next thing I knew, we were right in the middle of a black, tarry rain. That was the radioactive rain that came down. And I recall very clearly people dead, just standing. And you would think they were still alive standing there. And they are just completely charred. People on bicycles in an upright position, frozen and dead.
My first impression was of darkness. I suppose it was all the ashes that were thrown up in the air. As it cleared up, you could see people in waves coming, and they were burned. You could not tell which was their face or which part their back. It seemed they were in a daze. Most of them were stunned. Many were crying. Mothers carrying their half-burned children. The mothers themselves were burned, more than half of their bodies. Skin hanging from the child, skin hanging from their own bodies, practically to the ground.
Scientists have now had 39 years to quantify the effects of the 2 bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Effects so overwhelming in scale that although both official and independent publications now write of nuclear war, military thinking is still dominated by the effects of single weapons. Weapons of ever-increasing ingenuity and accuracy. The standard nuclear warfare textbook, published by the American Department of Defense, comes complete with a handy plastic computer. You can dial the warhead yield to give the optimum outcome. Many tests of fireball and blast wave from small single warheads were carried out on military equipment in Nevada and the Soviet Union. 450 nuclear warheads were exploded in the atmosphere before the test ban treaty was signed in 1963.
But often torn to pieces or hurled great distances, at overpressures from which no such effects were predicted. Pressures which had done negligible damage to identical items on Shot 9. A study of tactical importance. 145 ponderosa pines set in concrete.
To the military, a forest is only a place where you hide troops or shelter them from attack. So they cut down pine trees, then planted them in concrete in the desert to measure what happened.
Pitot-type dynamic pressure detectors and snubber wire arrangements to measure deflection. Static pressures around 4 psi. Post-blast survey indicated that
this is not the way to find out what a nuclear blast does to a living forest. American and British tests were in deserts or on Pacific islands, where it was impossible to measure their effects on the fragile living ecosystems that support life on this planet. Here at Brookhaven, New York, a forest was subjected to gamma rays, similar to those that occur with a nuclear explosion. The radiation from a small source on a tower destroyed all vegetation at the center. Further away, as it became less intense, the more resistant plants could survive. The hardiest plants were grass and sedges, and some species of lichens. It was also discovered some populations of insect pests increased. Pine trees were killed more easily than oak, but the steady radiation used here was very different from the beta and gamma doses that come from fallout. Meanwhile, in 1952, America had exploded the first H-bomb, 1,000 times more powerful than the atom bombs. More and more power was added to the nuclear arsenals. There have now been over 1,400 warheads tested. All the death and devastation of World War II was caused by the equivalent of 3 million tons of high explosive, 3 megatons. If we represent all that power by one symbol, this is the equivalent power of the world nuclear arsenal now. $18,000 million tons, more than 1 million Hiroshimas. Less than 1% of this explosive power would be enough to destroy every large and medium-sized city in the world. This is what just 1 ton of high explosive can do. This was an 8-story building, the headquarters of the US Marines in Lebanon. 1 ton of explosive reduced it to rubble and killed 241 people. We have now stored in the nuclear arsenal the power of more than 4 tons of explosive for every man, woman, and child on the planet. How did this happen? In 1945, there were just 2 nuclear bombs used by America against Japan. By 1952, America had 1,000 bombs and Russia probably had about 6. The nuclear arms race had begun. In the late 1960s, America scrapped some of its earlier obsolete bombs and the total went down for a while. Britain probably now has about 1,000 warheads. France and China, roughly the same total each. There are now about 54,000 nuclear warheads. Modern missiles are more accurate, so the warheads are smaller, but the numbers are going up again. 10 new warheads are made every day. How are such enormous numbers targeted? Modern nuclear war strategy is to aim warheads first at priority targets, missile silos, and missile-carrying submarine bases. Then the vital communications, radar and intelligence centers. Then major airfields and naval bases. It's generally accepted by military analysts that once a nuclear war starts, it will inevitably become a major exchange. To the layman, it would seem obvious that the explosion of some 5 or more billion tons of weapon power would seriously damage the planet. But until 1982, all published scientific work maintained the opposite. The first clue that this might be an appalling error came completely by accident, and ironically, by looking at a different planet altogether. In November 1971, a spacecraft was launched. It was Mariner 9, the first to orbit another planet. As it approached Mars, astronomers eagerly awaited their first close-up look at the red planet. Suddenly, to their dismay, a huge global dust storm completely hid its features. One of the research teams studying Mars was Carl Sagan of Cornell University, New York.
There was an instrument on board the spacecraft which was able to measure the temperature at various levels in the Martian atmosphere and down to the surface despite the dust cover. And what the instrument showed was that the upper atmosphere was much warmer than was usual for Mars, and the surface was much colder than was usual for Mars. And qualitatively, the reason is very clear. The fine dust absorbs sunlight high up and heats the surrounding air. Because the fine dust absorbs the sunlight can't get down to the surface as much as it ordinarily does, and so the surface was cooler and darker.
It was another 5 years before Viking 2 actually landed on Mars and radioed back photographs showing the drifts of fine dust that had caused the trouble. In the meantime, the astronomers looked for ways to apply their new knowledge. One of Sagan's colleagues, now working at NASA in California, is Brian Toon.
When we did these studies to understand how the dust had changed the atmosphere of Mars, it occurred to us that a similar thing happened on the Earth. Gigantic volcanoes went off, put massive amounts of material into the atmosphere of the Earth, and perhaps changed the climate. So there is an interesting parallel between Mars and the Earth. Now, even though Martian dust storms occur every year so that one has simple and obvious observations of these things, gigantic volcanoes don't erupt very frequently, fortunately, on the Earth. And there, in fact, has only been one in the last century. So the only way for us to really understand how these volcanoes affect climate was to try to make models to predict what the clouds from the volcanoes were like, so that given the lack of observations, we could make a computer model to provide us with computer observations.
Then, again by chance, in May 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted, only 600 miles away in Oregon. The eruption was through a quarter of a cubic mile of dust and ash high into the atmosphere. Downwind, the effect was dramatic. This is midday in the town of Yakima. The sunlight has been completely cut off by the falling ash. The people of Yakima thought it was the end of the world, but the effect was only local. In April 1982, another volcano, El Chichon, blew up in the remote Chiapas province of Mexico. 200 lives were lost in the village of San Francisco Leon, overwhelmed by the eruption at dawn on Palm Sunday. Plumes of dust from the eruptions could be seen clearly on infrared satellite photographs. The dust circled the globe in 3 weeks. And it was no ordinary cloud.
The cloud contains about 10 million tons of sulfuric acid, so concentrated that if you got it on your hands, you'd be badly burned. And the effects of this cloud on the sunlight, which is trying to pass through the cloud and get to the surface where it can warm us, those effects are very dramatic and obvious to everyone. In the sunsets that we've seen between 1982 and on into 1984, beautiful purple and violet colors have been seen, and these are due to the volcanic particles. There's also a large whitish area that's very bright around the sun, and that's due also to these volcanic particles scattering the sunlight out into the sky. Now, when these particles scatter the sunlight, they scatter a lot out into the sky, but they also scatter some back to space. That means less sunlight gets to the Earth's surface. And when less sunlight gets to the Earth's surface, it loses energy and begins to cool off. Now, the effects of the volcano on the Earth's surface are small. They're hardly bigger than the random year-to-year fluctuations in our climate. That makes it very difficult for us to reliably detect them. But nevertheless, there are good reasons for believing that this volcanic cloud has played an important role in causing the climatic anomalies of 1982 and 1983, some of which have been century extremes in weather.
Mount St. Helens had thrown ash to the height at which passenger jets fly, below the top of the weather layer, which is reached by the summit of the highest thunderclouds. So rain could wash out the ash fairly quickly, and it had no lasting effect on the climate. Above this troposphere is the stratosphere, a region where the air is thin, cold, and stable. The cloud of sulfates from El Chichon erupted with more force. It rose high into the stratosphere, where it will remain for years, scattering the energy of the sun. But there have been far more dramatic dust clouds. One may have killed off the dinosaurs. There is compelling evidence that they were made extinct by a meteorite hitting the Earth.
Well, in 1980, a group of scientists at Berkeley, led by Walter and Louis Alvarez, discovered that the Earth was covered by a layer of meteoritic material about a centimeter thick. And this meteoritic material is found in rocks about 65 million years ago, marking a position below which dinosaurs and other creatures of long ago eras existed, and above which they had all vanished. So it appeared experimentally that this meteoritic layer was the cause somehow of the extinction of more than 50% of all of the species on the planet. It was a mammoth catastrophe attached to this meteoritic impact. Well, the evidence that was found for the meteorite didn't explain how it could be that the meteorite would have led to the extinctions. So our interest was, what effects would a large amount of meteoritic dust spread globally in the atmosphere have? You know, would it block out the sun or not? Would it cause the Earth to warm up or to cool off? We found to our surprise that the effects were very dramatic. Not only was light totally blocked off from the surface for a period of 3 or 4 months, but the surface temperatures over the continental regions plummeted rapidly below freezing. So we had a condition where over the continents there was no light to see and temperatures were below freezing.
During those months of darkness, plants would have died, animals starved. As recently as 1975, the American National Academy of Sciences published a report maintaining that there would be little atmospheric effect from dust after a nuclear war. It was only by chance that Brian Toon was drawn to examine this question.
During our dinosaur work, I happened to attend a meeting in which I presented the results of our studies of what the big meteoritic cloud might have done to the Earth's climate. And at that meeting, there were several people who happened to be interested themselves in the nuclear war issue. And they asked me and my colleagues who had studied the dinosaur problem to think about what nuclear wars might be like and how they might be related to the dinosaur problem. So in response to that, we did begin to think about this question. And much to our surprise, we discovered that even considering only the dust that was lifted by surface explosions of nuclear weapons, that very significant amounts of dust might be lifted into the atmosphere. And the critical ingredient, I think, that we had that allowed us to make some progress in this area was a model that could calculate what the physics of such clouds of dust might be. Previous to our studies of volcanic explosions, no one had such a model. So it was not until the time that this model was developed that one could really quantify the density of the nuclear clouds that might develop after a large-scale war.
It was the Royal Academy of Sciences of a neutral country, Sweden, that commissioned the next crucial scientific report. This review by leading scientists in many fields was published in 1982. 2 atmospheric chemists were asked to calculate whether nuclear explosions would produce ozone in the troposphere. Director of the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry in West Germany is Paul Crutzen.
We made the calculations and found out that a lot of ozone could be produced in the troposphere and close to the ground. And then, when we were about ready to publish the paper, as an afterthought, we started thinking about smoke, how much smoke would be produced. And we looked into that and then found that due to forest fires alone, large amounts of smoke would be produced which would block out sunlight.
This afterthought that smoke from nuclear war would have a serious effect on sunlight and climate had never been investigated by scientists, as Paul Crutzen was amazed to discover. He calculated that in a nuclear war, an area of forest the size of Scandinavia would be set on fire and produce 100 million tons of smoke. Of course, cities would burn too, as San Francisco did in 1906. In World War II, in the blitzes on London, Portsmouth and Coventry, a mixture of high explosive and fire bombs were used to devastating effect. The Allies later used similar weapons on Dresden and Hamburg, creating firestorms. Nowadays, cities and industrial areas contain large quantities of chemicals and plastics that burn with dense black smoke. This was Flixborough in 1974. Refineries and oil wells would also be hit. These might burn for months. But to know how much smoke would be produced in a war, you first have to estimate where the missiles and bombs are aimed. These are just some of the priority military targets. An analysis of them was made by Richard Turco.
In the United States, for example, there are literally hundreds of military bases, logistics centers, communication centers, and so forth that could come under attack in a nuclear exchange. It happens that many of these targets are located near cities or in cities or urbanized areas. And so it follows that in a full military attack, or what's referred to as a counter-force attack of any magnitude where many, many targets are involved, that many urban areas would come under collateral damage. By that I mean the area around the target is destroyed with the target, because the strategic nuclear weapons have such power that they can literally destroy hundreds of square kilometers of area.
Richard Turco assumed at first that about 1/3 of the nuclear arsenal was exploded, 5,000 megatons. Working with Turco, Toon and Sagan was Tom Ackerman. His task was to compute what effect the soot and dust would have on the Earth's temperature. All of them did the work in their spare time. Their computer model is known as the TAPS model, from the initials of the authors. They programmed the computer as follows. The fireballs of the largest nuclear explosions, from 1 megaton up to 20 megatons, together lift 1,000 million tons of dust high into the atmosphere. 80% reaches the stratosphere. 1/5 of the explosive power was assumed to hit military and industrial targets in cities. Half of these impacts cause significant fires. 5% become firestorms, which lift the smoke high into the stratosphere. Forest fires burn an area the size of Scandinavia, raging for over 10 days. Fires at oil wells and refineries contribute 7% of the smoke and last 30 days. The TAPS computer program assumes that the smoke and dust are spread evenly worldwide and then cuts a slice through the atmosphere. The result is that 25% of the sun's energy is scattered back to space by the dust in the stratosphere. Of the remaining rays, most are absorbed by the soot. This heats the upper troposphere. Only 1% gets through to ground level, causing twilight at noon. a far more severe effect than anybody had expected.
The first figures that came out showed that the surface was getting very cold, and much colder than we had anticipated, much colder than we had found temperatures in other climate experiments that we had done. So there was a considerable sense of surprise, and I and some of the other people involved spent a good deal of time then looking at the model, trying to make sure the model was behaving properly, to make sure that we understood the reasons for why we were getting these kinds of temperatures.
The results are shown as a graph of temperature against time in days. The horizontal line is freezing point. A few days after the war, the temperature drops rapidly to 23 degrees centigrade below zero. It then recovers over the next 6 months. This graph implied the end of the natural world as we know it.
When we began our work, people thought that nuclear wars would do nothing to the climate, that their effects would be limited to the zone which was actually attacked. Our work was designed to answer the simple question, would there be a large effect on the climate and on people outside the combat zone due to a nuclear war? And these models do suggest very strongly that for a very wide range of possible nuclear wars and for a very wide range of guesses about the things we're not sure about, that there could indeed be very large effects on the atmosphere.
It became important to get some critical assessment and to encourage others to do corroboratory or conflicting calculations. We held a 5-day meeting in Cambridge, Massachusetts in April 1983, involving almost 100 scientists, physical scientists to look at the climate effects, the nuclear winter, and a number of distinguished biologists to explore for the first time what the biological consequences were. At my urging, there was a Soviet scientist who attended that meeting.
Following the meeting, new calculations were made at the computing center of the Soviet Academy of Sciences by Vladimir Alexandrov.
The first point is that the main consequence of the nuclear conflict will be very sharp temperature drop. Can take place in some days, 2, 3, 5 days. And this temperature drop will be very big. We are talking about 20, 40, or 50 degrees centigrade temperature decrease over the territory of the United States, Europe, Soviet Union. And this temperature drop will continue during many months, say 6 months or more. It depends on scenario.
Dr. Alexandrov's model used the same war scenario, but was able to compute the results in the form of a map. After 40 days, the contours show the drop in temperature. Northern Europe, minus 50 degrees centigrade. Siberia, minus 40 to minus 56 degrees centigrade. Canada, minus 30 to minus 40 degrees. The behavior of the atmosphere of the Earth is notoriously complex and unpredictable. In 1983, for example, an ocean current change called El Nino caused global weather variations. But the two computer models were predicting changes in overall climate, which is much more stable. At Boulder, Colorado, is one of the most advanced laboratories for studying weather and climate, the National Center for Atmospheric Research. In their enormous computer room are two of the largest computers in the world, Crays. Using these powerful tools and adapting existing climate models in their spare time, 3 scientists began to do their own analysis. Starley Thompson set out to check the TAPS computer results.
We were actually quite gratified to see that our results did corroborate the TAPS results. In particular, we found that the temperature drops averaged over the continents under the smoke were about 15 degrees centigrade, Now that's about half the answer that the TAPS model gives. But then again, we have oceans in our model, and the heat transport from the oceans to the land decreased the overall temperature drop for the land by about a factor of 2, and that's exactly what we found.
Their map plots the weather for each day following the war. On the 8th day, it looks like this. The blue, thicker lines show temperatures below freezing. This is for July, but already France, Germany, and southern England are below freezing point. But the effect depends on how long the smoke stays there.
Smoke is normally removed from the atmosphere by rainout, and it usually rains out on a time period from a few days to a few weeks. However, we find in our calculations that the lifetime of the smoke could be much longer. The reason for this is that the smoke in the atmosphere heats up the atmosphere and forms a very large temperature inversion. This temperature inversion stabilizes the atmosphere and suppresses the normal convective processes which cause rain. Therefore, the lifetime of the smoke will be much longer.
From another climate research unit at the University of East Anglia came more evidence that was completely independent of scenarios and computers. Michael Kelly had been searching historical weather records to analyze the effects of major volcanic eruptions. When Krakatoa exploded in 1883, it threw 4 cubic miles of dust into the atmosphere, causing dramatic sunsets around the globe. But what interested Michael Kelly were the temperature records. Did they show a temperature drop? He looked at the day-to-day temperatures following 6 major eruptions in the last century. The figures were added together and averaged to reduce the effect of weather variability, and then compared with normal years.
The surprising aspect of our results was the speed of the response of the climate system to a major volcanic eruption. Temperatures dropped by degrees centigrade, a couple of degrees Fahrenheit, within a month or so of the event, so over the northern hemisphere land masses. We then looked in detail at the geographical patterns of temperature change and found quite a remarkable correspondence between our results and those of the Russian modeler Alexandrov. In both cases, the greatest temperature change was over the continental interiors, and in both cases, Western Europe appeared to lose the ameliorating influence of the oceans.
The temperature effects from volcanoes were, of course, far smaller, only a few degrees centigrade. Data were often missing, such as those for Central Asia. But the general global pattern is strikingly similar to the computer predictions. What's more, further evidence shows the biological effects of large eruptions. At 12,000 feet in the White Mountains in eastern California grow the oldest living things on Earth, bristlecone pine trees. The trees can live as long as 4,000 years, and within their trunks they hold evidence of the variations of the seasons for millennia. Valmore Lamarche of the University of Arizona has made a study of their annual growth rings by taking cores. When prepared and polished, the tree rings can be seen clearly under the microscope. By comparing the width of each year's growth, marked by a dark line, Lamarche has built up a precisely dated history of past seasons. But what he also found was evidence of spring and autumn frost damage caused by unusually severe temperatures. This shows up as thick lines, or even breaks in the wood. From the dated sequence, Dr. Lamarche can tell which year they occurred. The spring of 1884, just after the eruption of Krakatoa. Analysis of many samples showed that growth rings were frozen in trees growing in many locations in the same years. He then plotted the greatest volcanic eruptions against the frost damage rings. When Tambora erupted, 12,000 people died in the Dutch East Indies. The next June it snowed in New England. It was the year with no summer. Vesuvius, Avachinskaya Sopka, Krakatoa near Java, an eruption heard 2,000 miles away. Soufriere, Katmai, Agung on the island of Bali. The link-up between eruptions and frost damage showed that even a small change in climate could cause severe temperature changes locally. Mark Harwell, ecologist.
I think the example in 1983 of the El Nino event is a good case in point. Here, the average temperature decreases were probably less than 0.5 degree centigrade in the northern hemisphere, and yet the consequences were enormous throughout the world. For instance, there was a drought, extreme drought in Australia and in parts of Indonesia and southern India. And in other parts of the world, there were extreme flooding conditions, unprecedented rains in certain areas of South America and the southern part of the United States. And the winters were either extreme cold or extremely warm in various locations. So the key is that an average difference in temperature in that case of well less than 1 degree centigrade in the case of a nuclear winter, maybe 10 to 40 degrees centigrade, could have regionally and locally far greater consequences than just the average would imply.
So what difference would the nuclear winter make? These are the priority nuclear force targets and airfields in Europe. These, secondary nuclear force targets and major troop concentrations. These are only military or counter-force targets that could well be destroyed even in a limited attack. After a nuclear attack on Britain, it's estimated that somewhere between 1/4 and 2/3 of the population would survive. So what would happen to a town such as Ludlow, for instance, which looks relatively safe? Indeed, British government post-war reconstruction plans are based on the idea that areas will survive. To start with, wind directions are so variable that the population anywhere in Britain will have to shelter from radioactive fallout for at least a fortnight. And even then, the amount of radiation would be extremely hostile. The river would be polluted by fallout. The ancient castle walls, no defense against the consequences of the collapse of a highly industrialized and specialized society. No electricity. Power stations and the national grid destroyed by bombs and the electromagnetic pulse. No water, no fuel, no telephones, no banks, no manufactured products, not even soap or matches. The food shops would be empty. This is the amount of food a family of 4 eats in a year. 60 dozen eggs, 220 pounds of fruit, 370 pounds of vegetables, 540 pounds of potatoes, 200 loaves of bread, 820 pints of milk, and 520 pounds of meat. From now on, Ludlow is going to have to be self-sufficient and cope with an influx of thousands of starving refugees, many dying. It's cattle-rearing country, but any beast in the field will probably be dead from radiation. The others will soon be eaten. As for bread, if the wheat crop is reasonably dry, it will burn 17 miles from a 1 megaton fireball. Then there's the climatic change and twilight for a month. We did an experiment to find out what happens to 10-day-old barley if the light is reduced to 1% and the temperatures by 10 degrees. It's unlikely to yield any grain. On the right, normal wheat, an eared variety used for making bread. On the left, what happened when we subjected it to 3 weeks of twilight after 6 weeks normal growth. After 2 weeks of 1% light at flowering time, Our experimental ears looked reasonable, but held no grain. During the ensuing famine, the climate of Britain would be changed to that of Iceland. An average of 10 degrees centigrade colder. Michael Kelly.
What this figure hides is the fact that wind directions, wind frequencies are going to be drastically altered, and on the day-to-day time scale, the time scale of the weather, we may well experience a much greater change from virtually no change at all, 2 or 3 degrees centigrade temperature drop, to possibly a 40 degrees centigrade temperature drop, depending on whether the winds are blowing off the ocean from the pole or out of the continental interior. And in fact, this latter case seems quite likely given the predictions of the Russian model.
The productivity of the sea depends on sunlight, whose energy is absorbed by phytoplankton, microscopic plants. On these feed the zooplankton, tiny animals, including the larvae of many larger ones. This is the beginning of a food chain. If you remove the sunlight, the whole chain collapses, even if the ocean temperature does not change much. Without the sun and the plankton, the fish would die. In any case, it would be hard to go fishing. Dr. Alexandrov.
The ocean has the tremendous thermal inertia, so the air over ocean will be cooled slightly, and the temperature decrease over continent will be very big. It will create the huge wind on the seashore, which will be accompanied by heavy snowfalls. So probably the human civilization will be erased along all seashores all over the world.
What then about America? This is a map of target areas published by the American Civil Defense Authority. It is in fact incomplete. According to them, the areas with high radiation levels are these. Of course, this official 1982 map would be very different if the wind blew from the west. But let's assume it's correct. What difference does the nuclear winter make in Nebraska, the Cornhuskers state? Central Nebraska is almost exclusively given to farming maize or corn on smallish farms. Official estimates maintain that 46% of the American population would survive a nuclear attack. The town of Grand Island sprang up around an important railway junction. The town is there to service the farms, which only produce the one crop, maize. All the supplies to the farms, fertilizer, fuel, machinery, come from very large distances by truck or rail. The immediate impact of a nuclear war would be to cut off the transport that links Grand Island to the economy of the rest of America. Electricity and communications failure would probably paralyze the town. The supermarkets would probably empty in the days of crisis leading up to the attack. Every single item in this supermarket comes from Omaha, the state capital, which is the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command and one of the most important targets in America. The average distance food travels from producer to consumer in America is 400 miles. Most fruit and vegetables are grown in Florida and California and travel an average of 1,800 miles to be eaten. It's estimated that a third of fuel refineries might survive, but 80% of the workers would be killed. Commercial trucking would stop. But it's not only trucks that need fuel. Without it, agricultural machinery is also useless. Many of the farms would still have grain stored, but it would be hard to get it to the towns. To plant the stored grain without machinery would be next to impossible. David Pimentel.
To give you an example, We presently produce corn with an input of about 10 hours per hectare of labor, of direct farm labor. If you were to raise corn by hand, without this tractor power and so forth, it would require about 1,200 hours, which is 120-fold the manpower input. And in fact, in the United States, we could not produce our crops with manpower alone, even if you got everybody in the United States working on the farm to do the tillage, the cultivation, the harvesting and so forth. We couldn't produce all this if everybody was involved in farming in the United States.
So what further problems would the darkness and cold of the nuclear winter cause? On the 8th day, in July, the temperature of Grand Island has already dropped below freezing. One night below freezing is enough to destroy many summer crops. Across the United States and Canada, at least 1 year's harvest, and possibly 2, would be lost.
My own perspective of this is that I believe that this climatic change, and therefore in turn its impact on food production, is far more important than all the radiation put together, because we cannot go more than about 2 or 3 weeks without food, and this distribution of food and so forth. So that I myself would expect far more mortality due to a shortage of food.
The Great Plains of America and Canada are the breadbasket of the world. America alone exports about half of the total grain tonnage traded worldwide. Even if the harvests could continue, world trade would cease because of the destruction of ports and the world financial system. This would have a terrible impact on the population of third world countries, many of whom are already critically dependent on food imports. The darkness and cold would not only affect the countries at war, it would sweep indiscriminately around the globe, affecting all alike with appalling extremes of weather. According to both Russian and American predictions, the cold would soon reach into the tropics, to the last refuge of natural diversity and productivity on the planet, the tropical rainforest. Two-thirds of all living species of plants and animals live within 25 degrees of the equator. The rainforest needs constant heat, humidity, and rain to support the countless, intricately balanced relationships of animal and plant, bird and insect, that adds up to the Earth's main store of genetic diversity. Or more simply, the beauty and wonder of form and life. Mark Harwell.
Tropical regions in general are used to having constant physical environmental conditions. And the sorts of temperature decreases that are projected for those regions are unprecedented for them. They have not adapted to temperature fluctuations the way temperate systems may have. Therefore, I would expect they would be far more vulnerable to rapid decreases of temperature.
For this program, we subjected a rainforest abechi tree to 3 days at 4 degrees centigrade above freezing. The roots and shoot tips are injured. The structure of the cells of the leaves has collapsed. The tree dies. In the northern hemisphere, The circulating air does not normally cross to the south. So does this mean the southern hemisphere is safe? Starley Thompson.
We find that, in particular in the summertime, in the northern hemisphere summer, that the smoke cloud would not move south as a single body. What you're likely to see is that streamers of dense smoke would be torn off from the main cloud by wind shear and transported rapidly across the equator. Those dense streamers could make it into latitudes of, for example, Australia in only a few days' time, whereas the main body of the smoke cloud might take weeks. And if a streamer is sufficiently dense and large, it could drop temperatures below freezing in the southern hemisphere after only a few days.
The reason for it is not hard to understand. If you put a lot of soot and dust up in one hemisphere, then the atmosphere gets very hot because the sunlight is being intercepted by that dust and soot. The other hemisphere, at the same atmospheric pressure, there's no soot and dust, so it's cold. So in the northern hemisphere it's hot, in the southern hemisphere it's cold. The temperature difference is enormous, and so the air naturally flows from hot to cold. That's not the case if there isn't a lot of soot and dust in the atmosphere.
I would like to mention also that after the conflict, we will have very important biota-climate feedback. I mean the destruction of forests mainly. After this destruction, our planet will not have the main generator of oxygen, and the property of the land surface will be changed crucially. It means that the coefficient of reflection of the sunlight will be much higher, so the energy feed of our climatic system will be decreased strongly, so our climate could go to the new state, and this state is unknown to us.
It's no longer realistic to assume that you can merely go into your basement for a couple of weeks to avoid the worst of local fallout and then come out and resume life as it had been before the nuclear war. The simple fact of the matter is that the nuclear winter in particular that is projected and the radiation levels, the new calculations of radiation levels that are projected, mean that the world will be fundamentally changed. And nuclear war is not just a war among combatant people, but would constitute war on the environment itself.
Because their war scenario of 5,000 megatons could have such a catastrophic effect, the TAPS group were anxious to find out how small a war could affect the climate.
For example, we did a case. We studied a scenario of only 100 megatons. And just to remind you that 100 megatons is a tremendous amount of explosive power. But nevertheless, we put only 100 megatons, which is less than 1% of the current arsenals, on cities, and essentially produce the same climatic effects, or if you will, the nuclear winter, as we had in our baseline case of 5,000 megatons. The reason for this was very simple. In the cities is concentrated the flammable materials that produce smoke. So with only a very small number of weapons, one can burn a very large amount of the materials that we've accumulated in our cities and produce a very large amount of smoke to produce climate effects.
Another startling conclusion challenges the credibility of a massive surprise attack or preemptive strike by one side to destroy the other's weapons. It could be suicidal, even if the other side did not fire back.
The problem with this idea is that you might be able to destroy an enemy, and you may be able to get away with it for a few days or even a few weeks, but the environmental effects would be so great, even of launching only a quarter of the world's strategic weapons, that the large-scale climatic effects would eventually come back to get the original attacker.
Conventional wisdom, no matter how deeply felt, may not be a reliable guide in an age of apocalyptic weapons. We need to do something inside our heads. We must change the way we ordinarily think about this. Einstein said after Hiroshima that everything had changed except our way of thinking. And that's the critical point, to realize that we live in a completely different world than anybody did before 1945. So simply stockpiling more and more weapons does not make you safer. In fact, after a certain point, it makes you increasingly less safe.
The Moscow-Washington conference was about the fact that for 30 years, without realizing it, we may have been living with enough weapons to destroy the climate of our own planet. Yet it ended with cautious optimism.
On the other hand, there is also something that is very pleasing about this conference, and that is the fact that the prominent scientists who are sitting here, our colleagues, American scientists and Soviet scientists, are united in their views that there should be no nuclear war. That could only mean disaster and death for mankind. But I personally am comforted by this meeting because in our times, the authority of scientists is very great, and we should all bring our influence to bear in order to bring about an end to the arms race. There must never be a nuclear war.
In August 1984, the United States government began to set up a major new scientific study of the effects of nuclear war on the atmosphere. It will cost about $50 million over 5 years. The US government spends more than 1,000 times that figure every year on nuclear weapons.
Scientific thinking on what is only a scientific hypothesis. The prediction of a nuclear winter after a massive nuclear exchange stands as a hypothesis open to confirmation or refutation. Doubts about the thesis have been expressed most notably by Edward Teller, father of the H-bomb, but even he refuses to reject the possibility of nuclear winter. The Reagan administration has commissioned an urgent 2-year study of it. Later this year, the prestigious National Academy of Science in Washington publishes the results of its own report on the subject. Newsnight understands from some of those who've seen a draft of the report that it will not challenge the overall picture presented by Professor Sagan and his colleagues in a serious way. Our purpose now, after both threads and on the 8th day, is to examine political and military ideas that those programs deliberately didn't set out to do, but which are urgently raised by them. And there are 3 main areas that we're going to discuss in the next hour. First, can nuclear escalation be controlled so that it stops well short of mass destruction and the nuclear winter? Second, what lessons are to be drawn about Britain's civil defense program and its ability to provide either for the aftermath of a mass nuclear attack or the prospect of nuclear winter? And third, what effect does the nuclear winter hypothesis have on nuclear deterrence and our readiness to rely on nuclear weapons as a key element of defense? All these issues, of course, were given a new topicality by President Reagan earlier today when he talked about the need for more dialogue with the Soviet Union. Now, to discuss these issues, we have in the studio a panel of military and strategic experts from Britain and the United States, and spokesmen from the 3 main parties. They are for Labour, Robin Cook MP, a close advisor to the Labour leader Neil Kinnock and one of the architects of the party's new defence policy. For the Conservatives, George Walden MP, a Soviet specialist, and as a diplomat, he was private secretary to 2 former foreign secretaries, Lord Carrington and Dr. David Owen. For the Alliance, the SDP defence spokesman, John Cartwright MP. I should point out we did invite Michael Heseltine, the defence secretary, to take part in the discussion, but he declined to do so. Also, we asked for an official spokesman from the Home Office to discuss government civil defence plans. They too decided they didn't want to join in. Now let's start first with the question of how a nuclear conflict might or might not escalate. Now the film Threads took a certain view of escalation from a limited exchange into an all-out attack. Now, one of the central questions is whether a limited, controllable nuclear war is possible, or whether escalation all the way leading to nuclear winter is far more likely. And to start the discussion on this issue, I have in the studio Paul Bracken, Professor of Political Science at Yale University, and in Washington, Edward Ul-Haq of the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. Paul Bracken, can I start with you? Why do you believe, or in what way do you believe, that nuclear war will escalate pretty rapidly?
Let me start, John, by saying that I'd like to emphasize in the strongest possible terms that it is the policy of the United States to avoid the catastrophes that we saw last evening on television and that we saw described by the nuclear winter show. No one wants a nuclear war, least of all the United States, including a nuclear war in Europe, because it is inconceivable to me that if London, Paris, and Bonn are destroyed in some sort of a conflict with nuclear weapons, that the United States can escape unscathed. I think that's just a ridiculous theory. Having said that, let me also point out that it is, in my experience, extremely hard to get a nuclear war started. I worked for 10 years at an organization called the Hudson Institute, where we did policy-level wargaming for the United States government. We played games and games of all variety, and it was terribly hard to get such a war started. Why? Because people are terrified. They are scared witless of these weapons. Frequently, the umpires would have to rig the games to simply get to something like a nuclear threshold. Having said all that, I think we do have to take account of the existence of nuclear weapons, of the very large stockpiles that are on each side. And we cannot underscore enough that even one use of nuclear weapons is incredibly dangerous. The question that you ask about escalation, I think, is often misunderstood. It is often believed that somehow the President of the United States or one of our political leaders would like to fight a limited nuclear war. There is no such attitude around. In fact, it represents a last-ditch, desperate alternative to what? To an all-out nuclear war, which would produce the sort of nuclear winter and catastrophe we saw last night.
Can I just interpose there very briefly?
Certainly.
I think the question is, once one nuclear weapon has been thrown,
Fine.
does it follow that escalation from that stage onwards is very fast, or does it need 5 or 10? Give us a rough scenario of what you think escalation
The rough
involves.
scenario is because of the terror involved on each side, I don't think escalation is automatic once a few nuclear weapons go off. The problem you have is that one side uses 10 nuclear weapons. The other side can respond with 10 nuclear weapons, and it can escalate in that fashion. I believe that a small number of nuclear weapons can be used without automatic escalation. I think if you get to the hundreds of weapons, it is much less likely. And I think if you get into nuclear exchanges involving thousands of weapons, it is almost inconceivable to me that the conflict can be controlled. One import of this is to take what NATO has recently done, which is to de-emphasize nuclear weapons in its strategy, to build up its conventional forces. And I must say that although there's a lot of attention to the cruise missiles and Pershing missiles, NATO has decided in the past 3 years to remove over 3,000 tactical nuclear weapons from its arsenal, to emphasize conventional forces. Why? Because even if a few nuclear weapons can be used, it's too risky to have a strategy based on that. And there are alternatives.
We will get onto that, but once a few hundred have been exchanged, what are the precise factors which will make it very likely that commanders will lose control and politicians will lose control of the nuclear exchange?
The most likely factor is that it is not the weapons that we hear about which are the most vulnerable parts of an arsenal. It is the command and control system. And one can imagine politicians flying around in airplanes or being in underground bunkers. The problem is you have to have communications between the command authorities and the weapons themselves. So there's a tremendous incentive to issue orders to take certain actions in the event of a certain number of weapons going off, because that may be the last orders that any military commander receives. In addition, if we look at Soviet military doctrine, it places primary stress on attack of the Western command and control system. There's not a scrap of evidence to show that the Soviets buy any notion of limited nuclear war, something I consider most unfortunate, but I think we have to look reality in the face here.
Can I hold it there, Paul Bracken, and bring in Edward Luttwak from Washington? At what stage, if any, do you think that this process of using nuclear weapons, Dr. Luttwak, can be controlled, and how far do you feel that once it has reached a certain stage, several hundreds of weapons, said Paul Bracken, it becomes uncontrollable?
I think it is a wild exaggeration to think even in terms of dozens of nuclear weapons, let alone hundreds. The context, of course, is that there is a very large and powerful Soviet army. We have always steadfastly refused to match the Soviet army with an equally large and powerful Western army. And therefore, we have always relied on the threat that if the Soviet army were to advance, we would use nuclear weapons. Now, how many nuclear weapons, where, in what circumstances, that has varied over time as far as these declaratory policy is concerned. But we have always remained dependent on nuclear weapons, and we will always remain dependent on nuclear weapons unless there is a whole entire transformation in the attitude of all the NATO powers, including the United States, to the business of matching the Soviet army.
But how many of those can be used, if I may, sorry to interrupt, how many of those can be used before you get into the kind of uncontrollable escalation, which brings us to a situation where we have to consider the possibility of nuclear winter?
The facts about the Soviet army mean that we have to rely on nuclear weapons. The other fact has always been that practical men, serious people, have always understood that if you do use more than one or two or a dozen or 2 dozen, then the jig is up. There are no values worth saving. Hence, there has always been a belief, I think, in limited nuclear war, but the limited has always been defined at a very much smaller number than the number in inventory, because the number of nuclear weapons lying around, deployed in different forces, is the number that we have to have on the assumption that the Soviets might try to attack some or to neutralize them, or that they would be in the wrong place, or they're the wrong kinds.
But are you saying
so
that
yes,
a change of 2 dozen or so could take place, and at that stage, politically, the superpowers could say, this is far too dangerous for it to continue, that they would then pull back. In other words, the nuclear war could be constrained and restricted at that stage.
Yes, except that I personally, it is my personal belief, that even the dozens might be an excessive number, because the armies, the institutions, the command, the political structures are really not stressed to withstand the awesome images, the terrifying effects, or merely appearances of nuclear weapons. Just imagine that you have a very disciplined, solid force, like the British infantry, say, in the First World War, withstanding everything, all manner of artilleries and shellings and terrible conditions in trenches, knee-high mud or waist-high mud. Then suddenly the Germans use gas, and then you have the finest regiments of the line breaking and running, because that gas was the level of stress they couldn't take.
And nuclear
I
weapons
believe that nuclear weapons
nuclear weapons
would be much worse, and therefore whoever uses them for whatever purpose is going to discover that the institutions, the mechanisms, the battalions, the commands, the parties are going to just unravel.
Edward, look, let me leave it there for a moment and bring in our 3 politicians. Robin Cook, first of all, do you think that in particular the prospect of this escalation, Paul Bracken said maybe several hundred weapons, Edward Ul-Haq was far more cautious, a couple of dozen or so, he said, and the jig is up. The fact that this might lead to nuclear winter, does this alter the way people consider fighting nuclear war?
Well, I think if I can just pick up the last phrase you made about fighting nuclear war, I would hope that the mere hypothetical existence of nuclear winter would make it quite clear to every party that you cannot fight a nuclear war with hope of victory at the end. There can be no victory. Both sides are going to go down in the long term to the ecological disaster that they would create. If I can pick up 1 or 2 of the strands in the previous discussion, it does seem to me that it's much easier to cross any of the subsequent thresholds once you've crossed the first threshold into a nuclear conflict. I argue with some alarm the idea that you could even throw around an odd dozen of nuclear weapons and then confine it there. Because after all, we do know, and Dr. Bracken's quite frank about this, the Soviets intend to throw back, they tend to reply with everything they've got if they're attacked by a single nuclear weapon. They have no idea, no concept, no training, no expectation that they'll be able to confine it at that stage. Moreover, what I never understand about the idea that you can control at that stage is the idea that you then have to have a civilized discussion with the other side, having dropped a nuclear weapon on them, and say, can we have a truce now? That's unrealistic. It's pure fantasy. What worries me is that there do appear to be some people around who believe it.
Well, George Order, I don't know whether you believe that or not, but there are people certainly who believe that nuclear weapons can be used as a kind of diplomatic message in the early but acute stages of a crisis. That is classical escalation theory, isn't it? Do you subscribe to that in any way?
Certainly not. No, I think one must start at the beginning in these discussions. And we're talking about films, and we're talking about nuclear winters. I don't want a nuclear winter or a nuclear summer or anything else. And I think one must see this whole discussion in the context, the rather technical context in which it's taken. I don't believe we should start throwing anything around at any stage. I believe the film is slightly misleading in that sense, because I think that any film which is really worth its salt is not going to simply arouse people's fears, quite genuine and understandable fears, but not simply restrict itself to arousing them, but is going to try and deal with the issues. And I don't think either of these films really do that.
Well, to the extent that they did or didn't, that is what we are trying to do now. That is what it's designed to do.
Well, let me go on. I think that escalation has a lot to do with the political situation. It is not just a technicality. Therefore, I don't really like this idea of theorizing about how it might be possible to throw around a few here and there. I think if you look back at the film, and we are discussing this film, it all started in Iran, in the Middle East. Now, the fact is that a war has been going on in the Gulf for 2 years, and the Russians and the Americans have been exceedingly cautious about any form of military escalation in the Gulf. In other words, you could argue that deterrence is working, and we are, after all, fundamentally talking about deterrence.
Well, let's keep off deterrence for the moment, because we will come to that in a moment. But John Cartwright, what do you believe? Do you think that this sort of strategic this escalation is actually manageable, or is it something which is made more inconceivable by the prospect of nuclear winter?
I doubt it's manageable. It seems to me that the most likely way in which you cross the nuclear threshold is by using battlefield nuclear weapons. There is a conventional attack, it can't be held conventionally, and commanders are therefore tempted to use nuclear artillery, for example. Now, I agree with Robin Cook. Once you cross that threshold, I think you're into a totally unknown area. You simply do not know what is going to happen after that. And if you start using nuclear weapons, it seems to me that the risk is the other side will say, well, we're now into this game. Do we play it in a civilized way, escalating it stage by stage according to the book? Or do we not take that risk? Do we actually go in and hit them with all we've got? And bearing in mind that you're dealing not with people who are sitting down discussing it in a calm, wargaming atmosphere. This is probably after a period of tension. It's people under pressure. And I think once you cross that threshold, you have grave difficulty in holding it down to a limited nuclear exchange of battlefield systems.
Paul Bracken, do you think that it's possible that people will say, clearly strategic weapons are far too dangerous, but actually tactical weapons may be more usable? And of course, if tactical weapons are used, that would mean that they were more usable in Europe. Is there a tendency that somebody will think like that?
Without supporting or not supporting that position, I think it's likely that some people will come to that conclusion. And then if we think about the scenario we saw last night, it wasn't Central Europe, but it was an American president using nuclear weapons to defend a large conventional force in the Middle East, which was under attack. And it is all well and good to say that once we cross the nuclear threshold, we're in a new world. That's clearly true. And I think the odds of controlling escalation go down substantially to dangerously low remote levels. But the question is, what is the alternative at that point? I don't agree with the position that we should refuse to think about these things. I think some people should think about them, about what to do in the event deterrence fails. It's a very unfortunate problem, but let me play the devil's advocate on this. I think we should agree to think about certain unpleasant problems.
Which is a certain exchange of nuclear weapons, because that might stop a crisis from escalating beyond a certain point.
That's correct, and it would be a better alternative than to an all-out central exchange involving nuclear winters and hundreds of millions of fatalities.
Edward Ul-Haq wants to come in from Washington. On this specific point, Dr. Ul-Haq, that is it likely to make tactical nuclear war more conceivable?
No. I wanted to comment on the general agreement seemed to be on your side that the Soviet Union does not in fact accept the notion of limited nuclear war, and therefore that any attempt to use nuclear weapons, even perhaps 1 or 2 weapons, would then trigger this all-out Soviet response. Now, I think that we should be very cautious about accepting any Soviet statement on the subject as meaning anything at all, because, of course, the Soviet Union threatens us primarily with the non-nuclear army. We respond by saying, look, if we cannot contain this conventional military threat of your tanks and your men and so on, then we resort to nuclear weapons, and it is their logical propagandistic answer to say, do not try to seek security from nuclear weapons, because if you use any, we will use all of them and destroy the world and so on. Now, what I'm saying is that the Soviet statements on this subject are not a contribution to our understanding of the situation. They are to be interpreted as part of political warfare.
Are you saying that we should not believe what they say on that subject?
On this subject, because the implication is that they would act in a totally reckless and irrational manner and sort of burn up the world in peak because we have refused the Soviet army to win a clean victory by interfering with it.
Can I hear can I hold you there? Can I hear what Robin Cook has to say on that subject, that we should take what the Russians say on that question with a pinch of salt?
I agree absolutely. You should take, as either superpower says, a very large bag of salt. But we do know from the Soviet military posture, from its weapons, from its training, from its military manuals, that they expect to fight all-out nuclear war, and in none of these places, none of the manuals, do you find the least interest in limited nuclear war. Can I just go back to a point made by Dr. Bracken, when he said we've got to think about this and we should start thinking about the unthinkable? What worries me about starting to think about limited nuclear war is that if the notion ever gets about that you can get away with it, and I believe myself it would be a delusion under any circumstances, then that makes it that much easier and much more likely that you're actually going to cross the nuclear threshold. I believe it is much better and much more in the interest of the peoples of the world that both superpowers and both East and West blocks realize from the start that once you cross that threshold, it's going to be very difficult to stop. And since we have a consensus in the studio that it's going to be very difficult to stop once over the threshold, I am tempted to ask, why then doesn't NATO agree to a no first use declaration, which make it perfectly clear that that threshold is the one that we've got to hold?
Let us come on to that later in the programme. Let us agree that a certain consensus has been reached on this particular subject, and let us move on to another question raised in particular by Threads, that is the ability or inability of civil defence preparations to be effective in the face of a major nuclear attack. And we're still perhaps to provide for the survival of the survivors during the nuclear winter and its aftermath. Now, the picture painted by Threads, drawing on existing Home Office documents, publications and training programmes, was not a very reassuring one. To discuss this, we have Dr. Philip Steadman of the Open University and a critic of government civil defence readiness, and Eric Alley, President of the Institute of Civil Defence and Emergency Planning Officer for Humberside, about to join the Home Office as Civil Defence Advisor. And I should say that the point of the issue is not whether civil defence is or is not a good thing to assist during natural disasters or conventional war, but the rather specific one of what it can or cannot do in a large-scale nuclear exchange. Eric Alley, if escalation to an all-out mass nuclear conflict is a pretty likely scenario, what can civil defence do in Britain for the victims of such an attack?
I don't think that any of the scenarios we've heard, either in the threads yesterday or the film today, invalidates any civil defence preparations whatsoever, because it's no use us sitting down and folding our hands and saying there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. We've got to do something, and we've got to ensure that whatever preparations we have, however small, they can do something to look after people. And of course, the thing that didn't come across yesterday in Threads was the fact that it concentrated on Sheffield, an unprepared city, a city which has not helped its people, helped its population, hasn't given them any advice and guidance, hasn't allowed its officers to go for training.
Tell us, all right, tell us then what you would do, what you would like to see, and what would still protect people in a city against the sort of nuclear attack which we are talking about.
Now, we're not saying we will protect people in a city that's subjected to a nuclear attack. What we are saying is that with adequate civil defence measures, with proper civil defence measures, we can mitigate the effects of that attack. We can help the survivors to continue to survive. And the thing that didn't come out properly, although the implication was there, was the fact that there is something being done. There is work to be done for the survivors to help them. There will be certain food supplies available. There will be feeding centres. There will be rest centres outside the attacked area.
Even to survive nuclear winter?
Even to survive nuclear winter. It would mean that our preparations, as we have them today, with the establishment of our community advisor training programme, with getting the communities working in groups, they could then, the survivors could survive the nuclear winter.
Can I bring in Philip Steadman here? Does any of that convince you? If you had Eric Alley looking after things in your area, would you think that something was doable for the survivors?
Yes, I think it's very difficult to say that nothing can be done, and certainly it would be quite immoral to say nothing should be done. I think what's wrong in the government's, our British civil defence programme as it has been and as it looks as though it's going to be in the future, is that it isn't honest with people, that it tries to deceive people into thinking that the effects are not as bad, not going to be as bad as we saw on the Threads film. It tries to underestimate, it's calculations of the numbers of likely casualties have consistently been underestimates. That's, I think, the dishonesty. I think even in the worst case kind of scenarios, in the sort of attack that we saw portrayed in Threads, which is by no means a worst case, the calculations that our group have made show that there would be perhaps 10 million short-term survivors.
Can I just interrupt you there? I mean, there are two things. One, why should it matter that the Home Office says what its figures about calculations are? And surely the issue of civil defence is not whether you can guess the number who are going to be dead, but what you can do for those who are alive. Now, not with that context, do you think that a government civil defence programme can do anything for people who survive, especially in the context of nuclear winter?
Well, it depends what you mean by doing something.
Helping them to live better than they lived in Threads.
You can reduce the number of short-term casualties. There are ways in which you could do that. You could protect people from the effects of fallout. You could build shelters. There are other measures you could take. The problem with what now appears with the nuclear winter findings is that you are merely postponing the agony. You are, as it were, sheltering people only to face the consequences of what they then come out to.
So you think Eric Alley and his like cannot really help people to survive in any significant way under the impact of a nuclear winter of several years?
They can ease the pain. They can they can help people to die more easily, or they can try to do something for small numbers of people who would be in peripheral areas, perhaps say in the Scottish Highlands or in north of Wales.
Eric Alley, is that all you can do to ease the pain towards an inevitable death?
No, what we're heading for now, again, is this tunnel vision, this apocalyptic mode that we seem to get into all the time, that everybody is going to die. Yes, one can ease the pain for those who may well be dying, but there are the stronger who will carry on and survive. And I'd like to take issue here with Philip on the question that we've always underestimated the effects. We've never underestimated the effects of nuclear war. I've been doing this job now for over 30 years, and I've lived with it for that length of time. We know what the effects are. We've always faced up to the effects, and we've dealt with the figures as we saw them. But they're constantly being revised and updated all the time.
Can I just one thing clear from Philip Stedman? You are saying that these figures, which may or may not be for internal Home Office consumption, should be made public to the public. Is that right?
I'm not just talking about figures. I disagree with Eric Alley when he says that they've never made underestimates. The government, the Home Office, have made very, very serious underestimates, and they've been heavily criticised for doing so by ourselves, by the British Medical Association, by other people, and in the face of that criticism, they have actually withdrawn their figures. At the moment, we have a kind of limbo in which the Home Office will not actually produce any calculations. They say that they're revising them, but they've been obliged to withdraw their previous figures. But it's not just the calculations of how many people might be killed or injured, it's the whole posture of trying to avoid discussion, trying to, I mean, the very title of Protect and Survive, it's clearly intended to carry a kind of comforting impression, isn't it?
Okay, can you hold it there for a minute? Let's hear what the politicians, George Walden, I made the accusation that first of all the government Home Office is not honest about calculations, and that it avoids discussion of the issues both of those who will survive and of those who are going to be killed.
Could I just say that what we have been reminded by these two films is that the effects of nuclear war are incalculable. And of course, even without the benefit of scientists, a lot of people suspected that before, and you and I imagine, were amongst them. And so if they're incalculable, it's rather difficult to know exactly what the effects might be on humans, but we expect them to be rather fearsome. So therefore, it seems to me entirely rational to do something about it. Could I draw attention to one aspect of this, which I think is very important and hasn't been mentioned so far, and that is that if the theory of the nuclear winter is remotely correct, it does make finally complete and utter nonsense of the nuclear-free zone idea. It won't be any good hanging a notice on your door saying, I'm out of this, plague on all of you, because the plague will hit you whether you like it or not. And that, I would have thought, is another argument. It reinforces the argument for doing something, however much a contingency, on civil defence.
Just specifically what can be done. After all, we had this picture painted in Threads of crops failing for months, even years. What do you think that civil defense can do, and what is the government doing which can ease that particular prospect? Is anything being done?
Well, we know that it is being done. It's being done and taken seriously by this government. But I think it's a great mistake to present this as the central issue, or even one of the central issues. The central issue is to prevent the war by defense and by deterrence. Taking out an insurance does not mean that you're preparing for an accident.
I know we shall come on to deterrence, but this is an important issue in itself. Robin Cook, what do you feel about what Eric Alley said about civil defence?
I would like to take up the point that Eric Alley made about Sheffield being an unprotected city, and this came over in the film. In fact, in yesterday's film, what came across very strongly was the families that did try very faithfully and honestly to carry out the government's advice and protect and survive, to protect themselves, discovered the utter futility of that advice, because they were in a city hit by 2 attacks, one bang on the city, and in those circumstances, the house in which they built their inner refuge was reduced to rubble. So many of those who hid under the cellars were trapped under the cellars. Those that did survive the initial blast and the initial fire then found that they were open to the elements and open to radiation. Now, there is no conceivable way in which they could prepare in advance for those eventualities, and it is dishonest to pretend that there is any sensible way in which the people of Sheffield can now protect themselves against an attack on Sheffield other than getting out of Sheffield. And here,
well, even that with a nuclear winter is not much of an option, is it?
You can get out of Sheffield in advance of the attack, except that an important part of the civil defence preparations which came across in the film is that the government will send troops and police in to prevent them getting out of the city before the attack. The fact of the matter is the civil defence programme is deeply dishonest. It's dishonest to the public. It's dishonest also in pretending it's about the public, because most expenditure goes in protecting the government, the local government service, the police and the army. It's nothing to do with the public.
Hold on, and no doubt you might say people like Eric Alley, if you're being very unfair, but there's a charge
I wouldn't wish to be personal.
Well, it's far too nice, I suppose, but there's a charge. The money is not really being spent and cannot be spent on protecting people. Would you like to answer that, Eric Alley?
Well, yes. First of all, let me say this. I don't know which film Robin Cook saw last night, but he certainly didn't see the same one that I saw. Because, first of all, there wasn't a direct attack on Sheffield. If there was, there would have been a smoking crate around that control centre. Secondly, the people who did their very rough protection, one of them survived anyway and went off out, and you saw him eventually by the food stores. The other
dying of radiation sickness.
No, he wasn't dying of radiation. He was very active, in fact, around the food store. And the other people
who went dead halfway through the film.
No, and the other people who went down in the cellar, the only way they died was because a couple of looters went and smashed their heads in, but they survived in the cellar. So
they were still dead at the end of the film.
But they were dead not because of nuclear radiation and nuclear winter or anything else. They were dead because some looters got in and smashed their heads in, and that's the reason why they wanted protecting. And the other point is that the people who were who were moving out of the city weren't stopped from going out of the city. The city wasn't ringed with troops and police to stop them going out at all. They were advised not to leave the home because that was the best place to stay.
Let's move on back to the broader principles. John Cartwright, how much point is there, in the light of what we've seen, for a civil defence programme, and is anything that Britain has at the moment likely to be of any effect in the sort of scenarios we've seen in these 2 films?
I doubt it. My concern about the government's attitude to civil defence is that it seems to be neither one thing nor the other. It seems to me you could make a very clear argument that in an island as crowded and small as Britain, faced with the possibility of a major nuclear attack, there's nothing sensible you could do about civil defence. That's one argument. Or you could say, we may not have a dramatic effect on it, but we could actually reduce the impact on a lot of people, and you'd go in for a major shelter programme and all the rest of it, as some other countries have done. Now, this government's neither doing one nor the other. It's giving the semblance of having something, some form of civil defence, resting very often on local authorities who don't agree with it and aren't carrying it out. And there's nothing really solid and dependable there behind the facade, and that, I think, really is the worst of all possible worlds.
Are you arguing for a full-scale shelter programme?
I am not, no, indeed. What I'm saying is that I don't believe that there is a sensible civil defence role against an all-out nuclear attack. But why do we assume it will be an all-out nuclear attack? A conventional attack could cause a great deal of havoc, as we've seen in Beirut in recent years.
I wouldn't have thought there was much disagreement about civil defence in that role, but the question is, does it have an effect in the
But if we don't have the machinery, and we don't have the machinery very largely now, it will not be there to deal with a conventional attack or something of that sort. That's the problem.
George Walden, what about this charge there, that really it cannot do anything and the government is not doing anything, because it's neither one policy nor another, as John Cartwright has just said.
I think that government must do what it can in this respect. It must do it in a way that doesn't alarm people too much. It must do it in a way that doesn't give any impression that we are, in fact, thinking in terms of preparing for a nuclear war, which would be, of course, rubbish. We're not. But we must take account of what the Russians are doing in this respect, which is quite considerable. And we must be realistic about the aims that we can devote to it. But above all, let us remember that the effects of a nuclear war are incalculable, and therefore it must never start.
Paul Bracken, could, under certain circumstances, a proper civil defense program that's brought into the United States be seen as being destabilizing in a situation of East-West crisis?
We have exactly the same debates as we're experiencing here in the United States, and exactly the same charges are made. And there is some grounds to it. I mean, if in a tense crisis, our satellites detected that the Soviets were evacuating their major cities, that would be extraordinarily destabilizing and would be an example of civil defense actually tipping you into the crisis and war that you don't want.
Is that an argument for it or against it?
I wish I could say. It's a hard question. I don't think I can offer salvation through one path or the other. I'm just trying to point out the implications of one's actions.
Can I call in Dr. Ul-Haq here, because I believe you have views on the Soviet view of civil defense, which George Walden just referred to. How seriously do they take it?
George Walden is an expert on the Soviet Union, but one of the interesting things about the Soviet attitude to civil defense is that at home, of course, they have a very large program, a very elaborate organization, a whole hierarchy of civil defense generals. They spend a great deal of money. They build a lot of shelters. They do a lot of evacuation. They have lots of stores and so on. And at the same time, in their statements addressed to the West, notably England, they say, oh, it is quite foolish and futile to make any preparation against nuclear war. If you use any nuclear weapons, it'll be the all-out nuclear war and everybody will die, etc. I think that in your country, as in ours, we should follow the example of the powers that are serious about conflict and that calculate that perhaps the conflict will be so enormous that any effort will have been wasted. But it's just as likely that there'll be lesser threats, lesser conflicts, perhaps conventional, perhaps very limited. And these justify a more serious civil defense program than we have had, and perhaps than you've had.
Dr. Ul-Haq, thank you very much for that, and let's leave the civil defense argument there for time, because I think we should move on to the final section, which is the idea of the impact of the nuclear winter hypothesis on theories of nuclear deterrence. Now, is it undermined or is it reinforced? If a nuclear first strike can engulf the attacker himself in a nuclear winter, is this not a powerful reinforcement to deterrence, because it would appear to make a preemptive strike inconceivable? Or does the nuclear winter increase the urgency of new thinking on the whole nuclear defense question? Well, let's take that argument on with Dr. Gwyn Prince, Fellow of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and editor of the new study, The Choice, Nuclear Weapons versus Security, which features the views of senior military critics of present nuclear strategies, and General Sir Anthony Farrar Hockley, former Commander-in-Chief of North Atlantic Forces. General, first of all, are you changed in any of your views about nuclear deterrence by the nuclear winter hypothesis?
No, I should have thought that what we've seen in both films strengthens the view that the possession of nuclear weapons is a deterrent to war in a broad sense. Of course, I think we're occasionally in danger in this discussion in straying into the notion that all this is a new discovery. We know, do we not, that since the 1950s, when the balance of terror began to emerge inasmuch as Stalin's forces and his successors had got nuclear weapons as well as those in the West, that terror could be inflicted by one side on the other and expect to be returned. We simply have some new studies which show that perhaps it's even more awful than we thought.
So it doesn't actually change any of the calculations?
No, but the reason I mention this question of it not being entirely new hat but partly old hat is that we do need to see this in perspective. As Dr. Ul-Haq has said, the idea that's pervaded by many people that the moment we go to war there's going to be a nuclear holocaust is, to my mind, balmy. It wouldn't suit us. It wouldn't suit the Soviet Union. They may be a bunch of ruthless opportunists in the Kremlin, but they are not a member of the Kamikaze Club. They've got nothing to gain by going in for such an action immediately. And we are much more likely to have that period of conventional attack and attempt to hold on the part of the West than going in an early stage for nuclear attacks. We are, I must say, also, because it's the skeleton at the feast here, we are much more likely to have chemical attack upon us, which we continually ignore, and perhaps one day we can discuss this in a serious and similar way. But we could come, of course, in spite of all that deterrence, to the point where Sakyer's conventional forces are so weakened that they are going to break, being inferior in numbers, and he has to turn to the heads of government and say, within 24 hours, I have to tell you my forces will be defeated at one point or another, which will lead to a major defeat. Now, the only way I can in any way hold and perhaps gather together some conventional reserves is to drop a tactical nuclear.
And you're saying that that request and the calculations which flow from it would not be affected and will not be affected by the knowledge that a nuclear winter may be the result of the process that is started there?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the people who are going to give the answer to that question, you see, are the heads of government. They're going to say, yes, we think we must risk this, or no, we don't. If they don't, in spite of all the propaganda that's put about, mainly from the Soviet Union, there won't be a tactical nuclear weapon launched.
Gwyn Prince, what do you feel about that? Does nuclear winter change anything about deterrence, and General Ul-Haq thinks it doesn't?
I'm a little surprised by the General's response, because I think that one of the things that is made abundantly plain by the evidence is that insofar as nuclear weapons have a role in making already cautious superpowers, it is in making a threat which, as we saw in the program, can be made with nuclear weapons possessed in what's often called the minimum deterrent capability at far, far lower levels of both numbers of warheads and of megatons than we possess. Bear in mind that it was suggested for us at one stage that the nuclear winter, with all that that implies, can be brought on by levels perhaps as low as some small hundreds of megatons. And we now sit in a world which we share with some 18,000 megatons in whatever it is, 54,000 warheads. Now, if this is so, then I think some very important and interesting questions must be raised. One of them, and this does take issue with a point of view that's been expressed by a number of our colleagues earlier in the program, is the suggestion that far from anyone's mind is the idea of employing nuclear weapons in some putatively military role. It is plainly the case, and a clear part of the history of nuclear weapons, that one of the ways in which both of the superpowers have tried to square the circle of making an inherently incredible threat credible is to try and develop doctrines and weapons that appear to be usable. We are now, as I think the public is well aware, standing on the brink of important new developments, especially in Western strategy. We see the potential arrival of doctrines which involve the integrated use of nuclear, chemical, as the General has mentioned, and other conventional forms of weapon in the context of the European theatre, at the same time that we see the arrival of new and unverifiable and undetectable strategic weapons, like the sea-launched cruise missile.
Can I just row you back there and get back to the central point? Is deterrence more or less credible as a result of the nuclear winter?
I think it becomes less credible, and the reason that I think that it becomes less credible is that we must make a plain distinction between nuclear deterrence and deterrence. It's something which often gets left out in the debate. It seems to me that one of the things that has smuggled itself in as an assumption into our debate so far is the thought that the Soviet Union stands ready at every instant to plunge upon us and to take advantage of our weakness. Now, it's hard to see what the historical evidence is for that, but even if we assume it to be so, we're then making two further assumptions. One, that they having that intention, there is no other threat that we can make of a lesser order that would deter them. Perhaps it's best to dwell upon this for a moment.
Well, yes, can you, because I think it's still this central question. I want to hear what the politicians say, because they are the people who deal in deterrence, or their governments deal in deterrence. Does it make any difference to your belief? I think you already indicated, George Walton, but repeat it in the context. Do you think that deterrent theory, nuclear deterrent theory, as Gwyn Prince rightly says, is that altered by the prospect of nuclear winter?
I will listen very carefully to what the experts have to say, and I'm not against abstract thinking in this field. But my own reaction is that it will probably reinforce a deterrence which is already working. And I'd like to go back there and say again what I said earlier. I think the premise of the film was false. The premise that a war would start in Iran, I think it's false and demonstrably false by recent experience. A war has been raging in the Gulf, and there's no risk of a superpower conflict at the moment. Deterrence is working, and if this is a new discovery in the Soviet Union, as it appears to be in the United States, that will reinforce a deterrence which is already working.
John Cartwright?
I think probably deterrence is strengthened because the whole concept of the nuclear winter makes what we already regarded as being appalling weapons even more appalling, and in that sense I think the deterrence is strengthened. I think one thing that does come out of it, though, is to invalidate the argument that if Britain, for example, unilaterally gave up nuclear weapons and took itself out of the nuclear field by removing all nuclear bases, that would somehow make us safer. I think the message of the nuclear winter is that nobody is going to be safer as a result of this, and in that sense it makes our need to get superpower negotiations to reduce the nuclear arsenals even stronger.
Robin Cook, George Walder thinks deterrence is just the same. John Cartwright thinks it is actually strengthened by the nuclear winter. What do you think?
Well, can I first of all say that deterrence is changing all the time. It's changed enormously over the last 20 years. You have posed the question as if there is a stable level of deterrence which has existed during that period. But as the point's been made by Gwyn Prince, during that period, both sides have added enormously to their arsenals. Moreover, it's not simply a change in numbers, it's a change in the nature of the weapons. The weapons that are now being acquired are super accurate weapons designed and devised to strike the weapons on the other side before they're used. Trident is a first strike weapon. That is what it was designed for by the Americans, and that is what we're now acquiring from the Americans. Now, that type of weaponry in any period of international tension is going to greatly increase tension because both sides are going to be very nervous indeed about being caught on the ground by a first strike by the other side. So that constantly over the past 20, 30 years, we have seen deterrence changed by the growing numbers of the arsenal and also by the nature of the weapons there. And far from increasing deterrence and stability, that has made it much more likely that we may end up with the very war that these weapons claim to deter. And what, of course, comes out of nuclear winter is if we do topple over that threshold, if we do end up in a nuclear war, then the consequences are far more incalculable and possibly far worse than we ever imagined before, possibly even extinction of the human race.
General Farrell Hockley, in view of the danger, nobody pretends that deterrence is entirely safe. There is a risk attached to that policy, to every policy. But now that we know that the consequences of failure of a policy of nuclear deterrence are so vast, should that not alter how we think about it?
They've been vast for a very long time, and it's not a question, as Dr. Prince asserts, that we expect the Russians to break in upon us. The contention is that they are not thinking of breaking in upon us because they are uncertain about the dreadful consequences which might flow from it. We are not, at the present moment, giving anything away as to how or when or whether we should use nuclear weapons, but they are there as a sanction. That is the deterrence. And for the time being, it is working. Of course, we should all be working towards getting rid of these nuclear weapons. But they're here. They won't go away, as everybody knows, with a wave of the magic wand. And at the present time, the balance of terror is holding.
And as we now know, it is likely to be an even worse balance of terror. Dr. Ul-Haq in Washington, what do you think about the effect on deterrence?
Well, first of all, since we just heard the peroration from the gentleman of the Labour Party, which echoes this familiar line that there are more and more nuclear weapons and they're more and more dangerous. I think looking back on it, it is quite clear that the peace has been maintained by what we call deterrence, and the deterrence has been maintained by the very process of successively introducing new weapons to maintain, so to speak, a steady state of discouragement. Not, of course, of the Soviet Union leaping upon us, but of the Soviet Union threatening us from its position of conventional superiority. The arms race has been a substitute for war, not its maker. Now, on the nuclear winter, let's keep our numbers straight here. The current calculations say several hundred megatons bring about what is called the nuclear winter. Now, several hundred megatons, of course, is a huge quantity. It is, of course, a quantity that could not be expended even by the most reckless use of tactical, the battlefield nuclear weapons that General Farrell Hockley was talking about. The sort of authorization request that the Supreme Allied Commander might make would not concern hundreds of megatons. It would concern a fraction of that amount. Moreover, with reference to the nuclear winter, these weapons have indeed become more accurate, and have also become smaller and smaller in megaton yields. The United States now has perhaps 1/4 of the megatonnage it had at the peak 20 years ago. As we move into new weapons that are more accurate, their warhead sizes are also declining. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to get down to nuclear weapons so small that they're just more efficient conventionals. They will still be, but the danger of the catastrophic climatic and environmental consequences from the launch of a relatively small number of weapons, which would have been a very real danger 20 years ago, is no longer with us as of now.
Hold it there, Dr. Ul-Haq. Yes, sorry, Gwyn Prince is eager to comment on that.
Yes, Mr. Tusa, I'd like to come back to a point that's now been raised by three of our contributors, which is the observation that deterrence, meaning nuclear deterrence, has worked and continues to work, because this is an observation that I think bears a little close examination. Now, I think that one of the things that the world of nuclear deterrence has brought us, that is one of its greatest disservices in the last 40 years, has been a sort of tunnel vision. What's happened is that a perfectly reasonable and respectable military concept of deterrence has been lifted up and elevated into the sphere of the analysis of international affairs, and has led, as George Kennan has observed in the States, to the militarization of the way in which we look at international relations. And the consequence of this is that we view the relationships between the superpowers almost exclusively in these terms, and we place a hand, a dark hand, which covers whole areas of the human experience. Now, as Mr. Walden and Sir Anthony and Mr. Ul-Haq well know, neither they can prove that nuclear weapons in some conclusive way have preserved this quasi-peace of the 40 years, nor can I disprove it on direct evidence.
So what do you think has preserved if it's not nuclear weapons?
What I think we should do in order to find the answer to this is to look at precisely those areas which have been covered over by this preoccupation. Now, we have to look at intentions, and intentions are things which is exceedingly difficult to analyze if we are simply going to use the proper but now promiscuously and improperly used military concept of a worst-case assumption.
Okay, again, can I stop you there? You're saying stop counting Soviet weapons, Soviet tanks, Soviet rockets quite so insistently, and look at what they're trying to do politically. In a word, is that without a gross oversimplification of a subtle thesis? Yeah. Right, George Walden, can I hear your comment on that?
Well, I think it's a very important point, and I'm glad Dr. Prince has raised it, because one thing that's worried me about this discussion, and many discussions like it, is the overemphasis on technology of war, the technocratic approach, if you like, and underemphasis on the politics of avoiding a war occurring at all. It was, I think, Aneurin Bevan, when he reluctantly agreed to a British deterrent, who observed that weapons don't make war, politics do. That is now a cliche, but it was a wise thought at that time. And I think what we need to stop anything like what we saw in that film occurring are three things. One is defense, obviously. Secondly, you need arms control, which you can't have without defense, because the Russians won't talk to you unless you're armed. And thirdly, and this in a way is the most important thing, you need a civilized political relationship with the Soviet Union. And if I'm to be critical about the United States, I would say that I'm a little surprised that it's taken President Reagan 3.5 years to get round to shaking Mr. Gromyko's hand.
It might well be there isn't a great deal of disagreement in the studio on that, but General Farrow-Hockley. Yes, Paul Bracken, there is.
If we look at the past post-war crises, the Suez in 1956, the invasion of the Middle East in 1973, when the United States and the Soviet Union came to disagreements, there were times, at least especially in the 73 case, when détente was at its height. I don't think that good day-to-day political relationships necessarily solve all of our problems, as the 1973 case illustrates. We had very good relations at that time, but it did not stop the Soviet Union from aiding its allies.
It is a useful condition, but not, as they say, a sufficient one.
Exactly.
Robin Cook.
I don't think that we're in a position to choose between good international relations or trying to control the technology of the arms race. You've got to do both of them, and it's quite clear in retrospect that one of the things that undermined détente was the sheer mass of the arsenals and the pace of the arms race by which they were increasing, because you can't actually hope to have a good constructive dialogue with the other side when you patently are enhancing your ability to wipe them off the face of the globe.
In that case, are there measures of arms control which
Yes.
we can take? Would you suggest a couple?
Well, I think that you've got to view arms control as a process. Now, if I was viewing it as a process, my first step would be to freeze the present development of nuclear weapons. I think the freeze demand in the United States makes a lot of sense. General Farrar-Hockley did say that we should be working to get rid of nuclear weapons. As a matter of fact, at the present time, on both sides, and including Britain, there is a movement in all three places to greatly increase the number of warheads. Now, that is daft, given what we've just seen about the danger that these weapons hold. Secondly, I would go on the Western side for an agreement on no first use of nuclear weapons, which we could get with the Soviet Union, and which would emphasize the importance of the nuclear threshold as the point at which you hold any confrontation in Central Europe. And then beyond that, you could then get into the business of negotiating actual reductions in the number of warheads. I have to say that, of course, what Britain does, and this is critical, because we are at the moment proposing to acquire a Trident submarine system, which will mean that our own number of warheads will increase by either 8-fold or 14-fold. We don't know quite which, because it's a secret classified information. But that kind of escalation will of course be replicated on the other side, and will make it infinitely much more difficult to get away from the vast extent of overkill which we saw graphically in the previous film, and which, ever detonated, could mean, as we now know, incalculable consequences for our planet.
Okay, George Walden has made 3 suggestions for how we can improve the political climate. You made 3 suggestions for how we can do something about actual arms control, which is one of his categories. John Cartwright, would you like to suggest various measures, or do you agree with what's been said?
I agree with some of the things that have been said. I'm strongly in favour of getting towards a no first use situation, provided we recognise that in order to achieve that, we have to strengthen our conventional defences. We have to have a credible conventional defence to enable us to reduce our dependence on nuclear weapons. I think that's the first essential, and it is not a cheap option, and we have to face that fact. When it comes to arms control, it does seem to me that further developments of the ideas of build down, for example, so that every time you modernise a system, and we cannot stop easily the pressure for modernising and bringing in new technology into the nuclear weapons field, every time there is a modernisation, you reduce the numbers. That's the essential, in my view, on both sides to get those nuclear arsenals down.
General Farrar-Hockley, what about the proposal that Robin Cook made, saying that one of the categories that we ought to be looking at is a no first use declaration?
Why should we make a declaration if we are going to have these weapons as to how we're going to use them? To my mind, that weakens, it does not increase the prospect of deterrence. And why should we put the slightest faith on a statement by the Soviet Union in peace that it will not use, be the first to use nuclear weapons? It has no need to, as a matter of fact, because its conventional forces, which are patently developed for attack, are quite able to roll over our conventional forces in any prolonged war, both in the numbers they've got and in the depth of their resources behind them.
Queen Prince, can you answer that question? Why should we make this declaration?
If deterrence is going to work, it has to depend upon 3 conditions. They have to hold simultaneously and all the time. The first one is that you have to have a rational opponent who understands the threat that you're making. And the second thing is that you have to have an accurate enough understanding of what your opponent thinks that you can make a threat that is credible. Now, what I am particularly worried about in the way in which General Farrar-Hockley has presented this is that whilst I concede that Western strategy indeed pivots on his observation that we must create doubt, I believe that the political consequence of what may or may not be a desirable military condition is that it will militate against the second of those conditions. The third condition is one that has already been dealt with by Dr. Bracken earlier. It is that being rational, which is in itself, knowing human nature, an unreasonable assumption to hold all the time, being rational, having understood and been deterred by the threat, that your opponent is then going to be sufficiently in control of his own forces that he may ensure that they do not do something that you will misunderstand. Now, the problems that arise when we interlace nuclear weapons with this are legion, and the reason is straightforward. I believe that there is a consensus here in the studio that military forces should be designed to produce political signals that are clearly understood. And the central problem, which I tried to emphasize earlier about nuclear weapons, is that they make lousy political signals. Therefore, military reform within NATO, which I believe to be urgently necessary...
Towards no first use?
Towards no first use as a first step, as the so-called Gang of Four have argued in the United States.
That's the American Gang of Four,
not the British one. The American Gang of Four, not the British one, is indeed an important first step. But accompanying that, may I throw in a measure which we could have, if indeed President Reagan and Mr. Gromyko cared to discuss it, within 30 days, it has been said, and that is we must have a comprehensive test ban. That is the quickest and most efficient way of stopping the development of these new and extremely provocative weapon systems.
So a certain amount of nodding of heads among the politicians. Paul Bracken, as an American, no first use and immediate freeze?
Just let me point out that NATO is moving to a de facto no first use of battlefield nuclear weapons by its removal of those weapons from the theater, and they're doing that, they made that decision collectively and unilaterally. The idea that you're giving up something for nothing is just not true. We've had weapons there which you can't put on alert safely, you can't control them once they're sent into battle, and they do more harm than good. Not in my judgment, in the judgment of the NATO governments, which is why they voted to get them out of there. On the freeze question, I think that's just much more complicated and things has a lot of political constraints, and there's not much I can add.
Sorry, but it was the test ban treaty. I'm sorry, that was the point Gwyn Prince made.
But if I may pick up the point that Paul has made, in that case, if that is so, why is it that we have programs which are marching ahead in the United States now to create new generations of nuclear artillery shells?
We don't. All of those programs have been underfunded, much to the dismay of the U.S. Army. And the interesting thing about the recent NATO decision, it has not been compensated for by any increase in the research and development money for American battlefield nuclear weapons. We are getting them out of there slowly but surely, and we're doing it because we don't want to announce a no first use doctrine. We found the troubles of raising changes in NATO doctrine in the 1960s when we moved to flexible response. This time the policy is to do it first and not talk very much about it.
Let us end with the politicians. We have a particular east-west situation. Mr. Reagan, Mr. Gromyko will be meeting this week. Do you sense, in your more optimistic moods, that we are about to see a change in the sort of tension there's been between the superpowers, and maybe the start of the kind of dialogue which could begin to reduce nuclear stockpiles? George Walden?
I think we're beginning to get the sort of political climate that is essential if arms control is going to work. Dr. Kissinger often points out quite rightly that you mustn't overload arms control in East-West relations. If it's going to work, it's got to be wrapped up. You've got to put political flesh on the bones. At the moment, there are too many nuclear bones, not enough political flesh.
John Cartwright?
I would certainly hope that we're seeing progress. I think I'm slightly surprised there is any movement ahead of the presidential election. I think most of us had accepted that nothing very dramatic would happen ahead of the election. It may well be that the Soviets have calculated that President Reagan is going to be re-elected, so they better start talking to him now. Anyway, if it's moving in the right direction, I think that's a hopeful sign.
Robin Cook, do you feel inclined to any kind of optimism that the superpower tension that we've seen in the last 2 to 3 years is going to start unwinding?
I am very encouraged that at last President Reagan is going to speak to a senior Soviet member of the Soviet government. And perhaps what we need as well as a freeze of his nuclear weapon program is a thaw in his relations with the Soviet Union. But I'm bound to reserve judgment until that meeting's taken place and we see what comes of it, because unfortunately President Reagan has a consistent and unrivaled record of opposing every single arms control agreement that's ever been struck, even the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I don't myself think that we can rely on that meeting producing results. I do think the time has come when the countries of Europe, including Britain, have to take an initiative and a lead to break the logjam that's built up in the superpower relationship. And can I just finally say that there's been much stress placed in the previous discussion about the fact that we've had 38 years of peace in Europe. 38 years is a very small interval in the history of mankind. And if we project forward the kind of build-up that we saw in the last films, the nuclear arms, the nuclear weapons, and the increasing sophistication of them, it must be very doubtful if we can go on indefinitely with that kind of very finely balanced of terror without something upsetting it.
George Walden, would you disagree with that?
Some of the implications, yes, but the overall tonality, no.
Well, this debate has only just begun. It is, of course, a twin-track debate, first involving the critical examination and testing of the nuclear winter hypothesis, second, applying that hypothesis to the strategic concepts we've relied on for the last 20 to 30 years. I hope that in the last hour we have at least introduced some of the urgent questions that will form part of this re-examination, and to our participants, both academic and political, thank you and good night from this Newsnight nuclear debate.
A new series of Did You